Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming on the behalf of the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies, the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, the Economic History Workshop, and the Center for Collaborative History. I want to thank you for coming and like to welcome David Leonhardt to campus. So this is the second time we've had David as a guest, but the first time here on campus in Princeton. David needs very little introduction, so I'll try to keep this short. He's a senior writer at the New York Times, where he writes the flagship newsletter, The Morning. He's also been the newspaper's Washington bureau chief, an op-ed columnist where he was the Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary in 2011, a staff writer for the magazine, and then in 2014, he was the founding editor of The Upshot. And so he was one of the an early example of this new data journalism that has had so much influence in the last 10 years. Before joining the Times in 1999, he worked at Business Week and the Washington Post. And Leonhardt received his BS from Yale, but we won't hold that against him. I'd also like to welcome my colleague, Sir Angus Deaton, the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus. And so we're thrilled today to host David. We're going to first hear some comments from David, and I think you have some slides as well. And so then we will be, sorry, I don't think I've given the title yet of your book, The Story of the American Dream. Ours was The Shining Future. And so you will give us a bit of an overview for the next 20 minutes, and then Angus and I will have a nice chat with David, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Okay, so without further ado, David Leonhardt.
Thank you, Ilyana. Thank you all of the centers hosting this. Thanks to Angus for doing this as well. It's a pleasure to be here because I've now been a journalist at the New York Times for 25 years, and I've spent a lot of that time trying to translate data and academic research for our audience, and really an outsized portion of the research and findings that I've tried to translate have come from this campus, from Ann Case, from Angus Deaton, from Alan Blinder, from Ilyana, from other folks here, from the late Alan Kruger, and so it's a pleasure to be able to come back and as a small thank you, be able to tell you about all the things that you already know. I have also become a very intense fan of women's college basketball. And so despite being a Yale grad, I have a certain affinity for the Princeton team because I live in Washington, D.C., and it has become something of an all-star team for the Washington, D.C. area, including the current team. There are almost always multiple members of the Princeton women's team who come from Washington, D.C., and the best athlete in the history of my kids' high school is Abby Myers, who graduated here from a couple years ago. So it's nice to be here. So I wrote a book that is really a book of stories. It's a book of history as much as anything else. I tried to combine the stories of people who you all know, like Dwight D. Eisenhower, the namesake of Angus's chair, and A. Philip Randolph, and then people who are much less familiar, like Grace Hopper or Ann Gorsuch, although maybe her last name will be familiar to you. And in both cases, I tried to take familiar people and explain why I think some of their significance is less well understood, and take less familiar people and tell you why I think they're really quite significant. I'm not going to tell you those stories in this brief talk, but the most fun part of the book, writing the book, was telling those stories, and for anyone who digs into it, I hope they're the most fun part of reading it as well. But I want to give you a very brief summary of the argument that I make, because I want to get to our three-way conversation and then also open up to all of you. In many ways, my book is an attempt to answer the mystery of this chart. And you will notice the source for this data. This actually comes from an op-ed that Ann and Angus wrote that came out right when their own book was published, correct? Several months ago. And this is truly a remarkable and alarming chart. So if you said to someone, there's a line here for every rich country in the world, basically. And if you said to someone, well, the United States has the lowest life expectancy of any rich country, you could imagine, well, that's because we have a frontier culture, or it's because we're a nation of immigrants and there's something distinctly different about the United States, and it's not fair to compare us to other countries. But the fact is, very recently, less than a half century ago, the United States had a very normal life expectancy for a rich country. If you squint, it's a little bit below average back in 1980, but it's not much below average. And actually, if we took this chart back to 1960, you would see that it was fairly similar through the 1960s and 70s. The United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. By the early part of the 20th century, the United States had the worst life expectancy of any rich country, and it's no longer even close. And while obviously you can see COVID at the end of this chart, this is mostly not a story about COVID. This is mostly not a story about any one thing. Is it just opioids? Is it just guns? Is it just traffic accidents? Is it just COVID? No, no, no. And yes, to some extent, it's partly all of those things. But there is something distinct about the United States and about the modern United States, the United States of the last 50 years, where we are doing a worse job of keeping our citizens alive, which I would argue is the single best measure of the kind of living standards that we are delivering to people. Now, again from Anne and Angus, the fundamental force driving that grim trend is the trend for people who did not graduate from college. In fact, the line for college grads kind of looks like the line for a European or Asian country, right? It's still going up. Whereas for people who do not have a four-year degree, it stagnated really, really badly in the 90s and early aughts, and then basically stopped growing at all during the 2010s, and obviously fell really quite terribly during COVID. And so whether you think of it as the growing gap between these two, or whether you think of it as the fact that the United States has fallen to become the worst rich country in the world, and by the way, we also trail some not-so-rich countries. We trail China in life expectancy. We trail some countries in Eastern and Central Europe. In many ways, I was trying to answer that question. And I think a big part of the answer is that over the last 50 years, we have become an economy with very deep and growing inequality. And economic inequality matters to people's health and well-being in all kinds of ways. It affects whether you can buy a house in a good neighborhood. So this is data from Piketty, Size, and Zuckman that basically shows percentage change in each of the different income groups since 1980. And you can just see that for the rich, for the upper middle class, the 90th to 99th percentiles, an economic group that might over-index for New York Times readers and Princeton employees, it has basically tracked with GDP. For the top 1%, it has gone much faster than GDP, and for the bottom 90%, it has gone much slower than GDP. So how could this be affecting life expectancy and not just people's finances, but their well-being in all kinds of ways? It affects who can buy a home in a good neighborhood with lots of social capital and with good schools. It affects who has jobs in which they feel respected. It affects how much stress people have in their lives. And of course, it affects access to healthcare, which matters less for health than many people think, but still does matter for health. There are many series that show inequality soaring. This is a chart from my book. Again, it's all percent changes, so we start everyone at the same time. I like this because it goes back further than the prior chart. And here, we all kind of know the story on the right half of this chart, right? Which is that inequality has soared. This is comparing median family income with the pay of a company's top executives. We kind of know the right half. We've all seen that. Many of us think of increasing inequality almost like gravity. Like, well, of course inequality is increasing. That's the way it always was. It is not the way it always was. Within the living memory of many people in this country, inequality was falling in this country. Look at the fact that in the 50s and 60s, the pay of the median family was rising faster than the pay of top executives. Rising inequality is not like gravity. It's essentially a choice that our society makes, and we have made a choice collectively to have much more inequality. This is another finding that some of you may know. This is from research by the Opportunity Insights team at Harvard and Brown and other universities. This is research that I played a small role in by suggesting the question they ended up asking. And so if you were born in 1940, you were nearly guaranteed to grow up. You were nearly guaranteed to grow up and make more money than your parents did. Whereas if you were born in 1980, it's roughly a 50-50 proposition. Now, with all of these economic statistics, there is debate. Choosing which inflation adjustment to use is actually a very tricky question. There is serious academic debate. Some people argue that inequality has not increased as much as others. Some people argue that maybe it hasn't even increased that much at all. Phil Gramm, the former senator from Texas, has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal approximately every 3 weeks saying inequality's fallen and everything is great. And a lot of these are technical debates, and they're hard. I would say the bulk of the scholarship, the data from the Congressional Budget Office and from the Department of Labor and from the Census and most high-quality published studies on this suggest that inequality has soared over the last few decades. But there are high-quality published studies that push back on that. And so if you're not sure exactly how to think about how much economic inequality has risen, and you don't have the quantitative skills to analyze those papers, and to be clear, I do not. The biggest problem with my resume is not the Yale, it's the lack of any degree after the bachelor's degree. I think it's worth looking at other measures, right? Think about how the economy affects people. So let's think about measures of social health. Many, many measures of social health have also deteriorated since 1980. The share of children who grow up with two parents, as Melissa Carney, a Princeton alum, has pointed out in her recent book, Two-Parent Privilege. The number of Americans who spend time behind bars at some point in their lives. The number of Americans who suffer from chronic pain, who file for disability. Anne and Angus have gotten, rightly, a lot of attention for deaths of despair, but if you read their work, there are also many measures not of death, but simply of quality of life, that have really deteriorated for working class people. And so these non-economic measures are highly consistent with the idea that we have had soaring inequality in this country, and that our economy just doesn't work very well for most people. In addition to those social measures, there's also the simple fact of ask Americans how happy they are with how things are going in our country, and the answer is they're not happy. There's a kind of cottage industry of journalists and politicians, many of whom tend to be fairly affluent, saying, why aren't Americans happier with this great economy? And I think part of the answer is it's not that great of an economy. This is asking people, are they satisfied with the direction of things in the country? It's been nearly 2 decades since a majority of Americans said they were happy with the country's direction. That's true whether the economy is growing or shrinking, whether there's a Republican or Democrat in office. And the numbers, when you ask people, is the economy good, are not quite this dark, but they're not that much better. Even when the economy is growing, like today, huge numbers of Americans say that it actually isn't doing very well. And I think we should take their views seriously rather than imagining that they're somehow diluted. And then there's finally this chart I already showed you. To me, the evidence lines up very strongly that there's something we did starting in the 1970s or 80s that has caused our economy to stop delivering consistently rising living standards for most Americans. In the book, I point to 3 forces above all. Power, by which I chiefly mean political power. Culture, by which I chiefly mean the culture in corporate America, and how much the people running our companies feel a sense of patriotism and feel a connection to their community, as opposed to feeling a sense of maximizing their own income and their own quality of life. And then the third force is investment, by which I predominantly mean government investment. Private sector investment is larger than government investment, but without government investment, there's a whole bunch of stuff we just don't do. And I think one thing that I am self-critical about is during my 2 decades as an economics reporter, I don't think I've paid sufficient attention to the importance of organized labor and labor unions. Labor unions are not enough to provide a decent life for most people. Labor unions are flawed. I've been in a labor union, and there were times where it really angered me. I tell one of those stories in the book. I am a manager at the New York Times, so I manage people in labor unions. I understand that labor unions can sometimes stand in the way of important change. But the way I've come to think about it is if we do not have flawed labor unions to check the power of flawed corporations, we end up with an economy much like the economy we had in the early 20th century and the economy we have today, of extremely high inequality. I think this is a remarkable chart. You'll recognize one of the names on the bottom. And it shows just how strong a relationship there has been over time between economic inequality and the percentage of workers in a labor union. I showed you this chart already, but I think it's worth remembering that this isn't just about economic forces, this is also about culture. Corporate executives have enormous control over how much money they make. It's not simply economic forces. They're often friends with and colleagues with the people on their boards who are setting their pay. I tell the story of George Romney in the book, who is the CEO of American Motors in Detroit. His best friend was the chairman of his board from the Marriott family. In fact, Mitt Romney's first name is Willard, named for J. Willard Marriott. George Romney surely could have made more money than he did. Instead, he voluntarily returned a bonus when his company hit all of its benchmarks because he thought it was unseemly of him to make that much more money than his workers. No executive, including his son Mitt Romney, would do that today. It's just not part of the culture. It also was not part of the culture 60 and 70 years ago for executives to try to maximize their own earnings and their company profits through policy. Companies and unions fought bitterly during those years, but companies didn't try to destroy and eliminate unions. They tried to restrict their growth. When Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953, the first Republican president in 20 years, and Eisenhower was very much the candidate of big business, after he won, he went for 2 weeks to Augusta National, the golf club in Georgia, to pick his cabinet, and was surrounded by businessmen while doing it. He was the candidate of corporate America, and yet when he became president, he did not try to reduce the top marginal tax rate of 90%. It just wasn't part of the culture in the way it is today. And so when we see CEO pay not rising that rapidly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that is in part about culture. The culture was simply more patriotic and more communitarian than it is today. And then finally, investment. This is a narrow measure of investment. It's federal spending on research and development as a share of GDP. But in the decades after World War II, and particularly during Eisenhower's presidency, it soared, in part because of fears of the Cold War. And it really transformed this country. The entire technology industry, the entire internet, was built with federal money. The Department of Defense built the internet originally. All of the early contracts for these semiconductor companies essentially came from the military. And it drove incredible progress in our country. If you think about this country in 1860, the Transcontinental Railroad was not yet completed. So think about what it meant to go across the country then. Go forward 50 years to 1910, and think about how much more rapidly you could get across the country thanks to the Intercontinental Railroad. Go forward another 50 years from 1910 to 1960, and you're on the cusp of the era of jet travel. So again, in a half century, it becomes completely transformed. If you think about the last 50 years, or even close to the last 60 years, it now takes longer to go from New York City to California than it did 50 years ago. You will sit in more traffic on the way to the airport in New York. You must get there 2 hours early for a security line. Shockingly, the scheduled flight time from New York to California is slightly longer than it was 50 years ago because the skies are so crowded. And then you'll land in Los Angeles and you'll have a lot of the same problems you did. And so we've completely stagnated as a country in terms of the speed of moving around. Yes, some things have gotten better, it's safer, it's cheaper. But in terms of speed, we have stagnated. And it's not because we've hit some sort of natural limit of how fast we can move. Many other countries, movement is still getting faster. I imagine many of you have been to Europe or to China or to Japan. I've taken an 8-minute train from downtown Shanghai to the Shanghai airport. Downtown Shanghai and the Shanghai airport are further away than Times Square and LaGuardia Airport. You obviously cannot get from Times Square to LaGuardia Airport in 8 minutes. You can't do it in 18 minutes, and you can do it in 28 minutes in the middle of the night. But that is a sign of how much we have not invested in our economy and in our future. This isn't just a problem, by the way, of small government. It's also a problem of how we spend. We spend a lot more money on healthcare, a lot more money on Social Security, a lot more money on anti-poverty programs. Those are all valuable programs, but they are not investments in the future in the way that education and transportation are. And if you're tempted to say, well, that's because we spend so much on the military, it's not. We spend a lot less on the military than we used to. It's for other reasons. So to me, those are the three big reasons why we have produced such a disappointing economy. And I want to just end with two final notes. One is to talk a little bit about our politics, because I think it explains a lot of how we've gotten here. A central part of what I argue is that we now have two political parties, neither one of which is fully committed to this idea of lifting the living standards of most Americans, of particularly Americans who don't have a four-year college degree. I think the Republican Party is still enthralled to a set of economic ideas that haven't worked nearly as well as we were promised that they would. I don't think it was unreasonable, the diagnosis that Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan offered, but they made a set of promises about what would happen when we implemented their ideas, and those promises have not been met. Shrinking unions and allowing companies to be bigger and reducing government regulation and cutting taxes on rich people, they very specifically said this will lead to prosperity for everybody, and it has not. And I understand Donald Trump talks in a different language, but he still governs in a way that is loyal to those ideas, that a smaller government will be better for all Americans. And I just don't think it has been. And the Democratic Party has a different problem, which is the Democratic Party has hemorrhaged support of people who do not have a four-year college degree. And I think is often disdainful of the views of people who do not have a four-year college degree, and has told itself, not just the Democratic Party, but activists on the left, have told themselves a story that the reason those people don't vote for us is because they are ignorant and they are hateful. This is all about racism. We are on the side of truth, and they are on the side of darkness. And we can't do anything to attract them because we are good and they are evil. And I think that is wrong. I think it was wrong 5 years ago. Yes, of course the Republican Party uses race bait. Donald Trump, I've published a list of all the racist things Donald Trump has said in public life. I think it's the most read article I've ever written in the New York Times. Of course they use race bait. But I think it's just factually wrong to say that is the only or even the dominant reason that working class Americans feel alienated from the Democratic Party. And if I would have had a difficult time making that case to you 5 years ago, I think it's a much easier case to make today. Because in the last 5 years, substantial numbers of Latino Americans, substantial numbers of Asian Americans, and a small but statistically meaningful number of Black Americans have moved away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party, and that movement has predominantly come from working class people who don't have a four-year college degree. This shows that shift. I won't keep it on the screen for long, but basically what you can see is on the left, college-educated voters used to be more Republican. That's all those bars facing down. For the last few election cycles, they've become more Democrat. On the right, you can see non-college voters who used to be vastly more Democratic, and in the last few elections have become more Republican. This is one of my favorite, this might be my single favorite chart about American politics. It's by Lee Drutman. It asks people a series of questions and then puts them on two different scales, one social issues and one economic issues. The people in the upper right quadrant are conservative on both social issues and economic issues. The color of the dots shows who they voted for in 2016. This chart would be very similar for 2020. Somewhat more blue dots than red, but we might not even notice it. Of course, the people who are conservative in the upper right on both economics and social issues vote Republican. The lower left quadrant are people who are liberal on both, left on both economics and social issues. Of course, they are overwhelmingly Democrat. If you spend time at places like Princeton or Yale, you will often hear people talk about how they're socially liberal and fiscally conservative. I'm a product of the 90s. People loved talking about how socially liberal and fiscally conservative they were. If you hang out with rich people, you can be confused into thinking that that is where the heart of the American political center is. That's the bottom right corner. It's the emptiest quadrant in American politics. The swing voters of American politics are progressive on economics and conservative on social issues. They want Medicare, and they don't want a lot of gun control. These are exactly the voters who the Democratic Party has alienated. They've alienated them on COVID. They've alienated them on what it's okay to say. They've alienated them most recently and starkly, I think, on immigration. And I think immigration has become a particularly good issue. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm happy to hear questions about why you think I'm wrong about this. A particularly good example of how much the Democratic Party has become the party of relatively affluent people who have different views than working class Americans. Working class Americans, like working class people of nearly all countries, are not in favor of very high levels of immigration. It is true across racial groups. When a progressive firm did an analysis to try to figure out why Texas had moved to the right in 2020, it cited two factors above all: COVID lockdowns. Working class Latinos wanted society to open up more quickly. I would argue they had science on their side in having that belief. They also wanted tighter border security than they had. The Democratic Party has very much become the party of more open borders, even if it's not the party of open borders. I would encourage you to read the party's 2020 platform on immigration. I couldn't find a single sentence about border security in that platform. It's long. It's all about making it easier for people to come to our country. And the Democratic Party has said this is an economic free lunch, that everyone benefits. I think that's questionable on the empirics, and certainly it's not what voters want. And although my book is not about immigration, it's just one chapter. It's the chapter I feared writing the most. I feared the blowback I would get to it. And actually, it's the chapter that I've been most pleased with the response. Many people have said to me, I'm not sure I agree with you, but you caused me at least to question my own beliefs. If this reminds you at all of the Union chart, it should, because this shows inequality in a different way. It shows the income share of the bottom half of US households, and it shows the share of the American population that is foreign-born. We've essentially had three eras over the last 125 years: high immigration and rising inequality, low immigration and falling inequality, high immigration and rising inequality again. I don't think economics are the main reason for this correlation. I actually think politics are a bigger reason. I think when immigration is really high, it's much harder to pass progressive economic policies. But I think for anyone who argues that more immigration is always better and who is a progressive, it's worth spending a little bit of time grappling with this chart. I said I would end on two notes. My last one, weirdly, is a note of optimism. I understand why people are so dark and worried about American society. I'm very worried about this election. I'm very worried about the threat of authoritarianism. But in reviewing the last 100 years of American history, I really emerged struck by how often grassroots movements have changed our country for the better. The civil rights movement did it. The women's rights movement did it. The labor union movement of the early 20th century did it. The disability rights movement did it. The gay rights movement of the last few decades did it. In small ways, the movement to defend Obamacare against Donald Trump did it. The movement to expand Medicaid and raise the minimum wage in red and purple states has done it as well. And if you're a conservative, the anti-abortion movement is a grassroots movement that has been remarkably successful. Opponents of abortion did not respond to Roe v. Wade 50 years ago by saying the system is rigged, the liberals have all the judges, or giving up. They organized, they took over the Republican Party, they won elections on the local level, and they changed policy in this country. I still think our democracy has the potential to produce an economy that produces rising living standards for most Americans. I don't think the problem is that our system is unable to do it. I think the problem is that we have not tried hard enough to do it. Thanks again for coming. I'm excited for the conversation.
I wanted to start off by just telling everybody to read the book. I hope this is a compliment. As I was saying to you, the book is better than the intro, and that is not like meant as faint praise. Like, I mean, after the intro, I was about to put it down, but I sort of read the intro, and I know about this stuff. I studied this stuff myself, and thinking, okay, I kind of know where things are going. And then the book itself, the storytelling, and was just really rich. And I enjoyed the book, the middle and the end, like as much, even more than I did, just the intro. So, and I think a lot of nonfiction books, like you read the intro, 85%, you kind of read everything you need. And I think that's really not the case with your book. So.
Thank you so much.
So maybe one way to start things off, I mean, you wanted to end on a note of optimism, and I want to take issue with that.
Please do. It might be more my emotional.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sure your editor said you had to, end on an optimistic note maybe. But when I think about the 20th century, and I think about left-wing movements, I think it's easy enough to think of the anti-abortion movement. Right-wing movements will always have success, I think. I think that is, it's a lot harder, I think, to engineer left-wing movements, like movements that are really, claiming power from elites. And I think a good argument is that it only happens in times of crisis. You think of, the way you tell the Union story is true, but I think maybe if I were telling it, I would tell more about the role of World War II, which you talk about but don't emphasize quite as much. There was a grassroots movement, for sure.
Yep.
And that grassroots movement had a lot to do with organizing GM. GM was organized in 1937, pre-war. But the rest of major US industry, it takes the defense contracts that are being handed out by the federal government for defending Europe. And Ford, as anti-union as he was not going to miss out on those contracts. And that wasn't grassroots, right? I mean, that was coming from a total crisis in Europe. And so how do you, I can imagine that we'll have another crisis, and that gives a chance for a left-wing movement. And I guess I agree that there has to be the grassroots to begin with. You could imagine a world where we have World War II contracts and there's no union bargain that comes along with it. But I have a darker view of it doesn't happen without something really bad happening first.
So I'll both answer, and then maybe there's something I want to ask Angus. But I realize I'm a journalist, I'm used to asking questions. I'm supposed to answer them up here too. I think to some extent you partially answered your own question, which is you needed the grassroots movement of the 30s to produce the kind of gains that came when the crisis came, right? And there's this lovely line. I'm actually very respectful of the kind of ideas and approach of the conservative movement of the 60s and 70s. Milton Friedman, Robert Bork to me is the classic. Robert Bork is a major figure in my book, and I liked him because everyone knows his name. But in the economics faculty, you understand his economics importance. But actually, most of my readers don't understand. They think of him as a failed Supreme Court nominee. They don't understand that he is one of the most important economic theorists of laissez-faire economics, right? And if you look at what those folks were doing in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they weren't winning a lot of arguments, right? And Milton Friedman said that he's got a famous line. You may even know it off the top of your head. I quote it in the book. But it's our job is to develop the ideas that will be around for when the crisis comes. And I think that's true of grassroots movements. And I also think they can win more limited victories in the short term. I mean, the expansion of minimum wage at the state level over the last 10 years, those are real victories. Mm-hmm. They affect people's lives. Obamacare is a real victory that affects people's lives. And so I do think it is possible. I don't think we're going to repeat the New Deal. I believe in Jefferson Cowie's phrase, the great exception, about that period. But I think we can make a meaningful difference. And there's going to be a crisis. Because there are always crises. And so I think it's both, you can make some difference and also in the medium term, and then you can be ready for it. I mean, I don't know what the lesson of other countries is about, Benjamin Friedman has argued that a lot of social progress happens actually in good times. I don't know whether that makes you more or less optimistic.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, can I ask you what I wanted to ask you?
Use your mic.
My mic's not on. It says it's on, but okay. This one works? No, it doesn't. Does this work? Can you hear me? I used to teach in this room without microphone. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. I think I got two microphones on at the same time probably, so I'm not quite sure what to do. I'm scared of that. That noise is big. Expressed its for the last year or so. And your book, I thought, one of the things I liked it enormously, so let me take that for granted. But one of the things I liked best about it was that it's part of a small, and I hope growing, literature by the intellectual elites, which I'm not using that as an insult for the moment, that not only does not condescend to the people who are hurting, which we are very good at doing. You know, we talk about them and us, and it's clear. And as you said, you're either wrong or you're a racist, you know. So it doesn't condescend in that way, but it also admits on your very important chapter on immigration that we may have been wrong. So it's not just, you know, you're wrong or you're bigoted, take your choice. We might have been wrong. And I think, you know, economists love immigration. So it's not just the Democratic Party, it's the whole economics profession thinks that immigration is great. And you pick your way through that very well, but I suspect you'll get a fair amount of flack here and there for people who just don't take your reading of the literature at all. I have thoughts about why that literature is wrong. I think it's a lot of it's to do with our failure of econometric and statistical techniques. But nevertheless, I think you're right there, and we were all wrong. And I suspect there are a whole bunch of other issues that the populists trade off, like trade, for instance, where I think if we were not totally wrong, we were wrong in large part. I think the all-volunteer army, which is, you know, a Milton Friedman thing, which, you know, the Chicago school tried to take credit for persuading Nixon. Nixon was ready to be persuaded, but I think that's been a disaster. And we're lucky that we got past the insurrection without the army declaring itself for Donald Trump, for instance. And I think, you know, there's a whole set of things like that, like foreign aid, for instance, where there was much more truth on their side than the academy and the intellectual elite was prepared to admit. And I think I know other people around here who are writing books, for instance, about COVID and how we got that wrong. And so I hope yours is the first in burgeoning literature. And that could be very helpful because it means we're actually talking to each other and not yelling at each other anymore. And I don't know whether there's time or whether we've gone too far and it's already too late. But still, this is a really hopeful sign. So I wanted to congratulate you on that and see what you think about that movement, as it were.
Thank you so much. There's so much there. I'll respond to two parts of it in particular.
Can you hear?
No, microphone.
Great. Thoughts on two parts in particular. And I'll say it into the mic. Thank you, Angus. Part of what I try to tell in the chapter on immigration is the extent to which our current immigration was sold to the American people on false pretenses. I don't believe it was a lie. I don't believe the people selling it, who were LBJ and Ted Kennedy in his first major bill as a member of the Senate, and basically senior Republicans and senior Democrats. I don't believe they thought they were misleading the American people. I found no evidence of that in the historical record. No one else has either. But this is the story I tell in chapter 9, so I won't give you the long version here. They repeatedly promised that the immigration bill would not lead to a meaningful increase in the level of immigration. They said this again and again and again. It was the core political message of passing the 1965 overhaul. They said we're getting rid of the old racist system of immigration. They didn't use the word racist, but that's what they meant, and it was racist, that basically restricted immigration to Western Europe. And they said we're replacing that with a new system that will give equal access to the entire world, but we're not changing how many people will come in. They couldn't have passed the bill without that promise. It was completely wrong, and it became obvious that it was wrong within 2 or 3 years of the bill passing, in part for some technical reasons. But even if you look at the research and you say immigration is only an economic good, and we should just be in favor of more and more of it, I think it's important to grapple with the fact that the American people never asked for the system that we have, and in fact were told a false story about what it would what it would deliver. And that's a version of what Angus is saying, that I don't think it's simply a case of there are those of us who are on the side of science and truth and lightness, and then there are the other people. And you mentioned COVID, and look, COVID very much affected how I think about a lot of these issues. I started off believing that the evidence pointed very much toward being a COVID hawk. I think I alluded to my daughter during the basketball part. She's a basketball player, that's why I become such a big. My daughter's 15, you'll be shocked to hear she likes to make fun of me. So her favorite photo to bring up is a photo of me wearing a double mask outdoors at a North Carolina rest stop in 2020. Now, I don't expect you all follow my career to know quite why that's so funny, but I have become a symbol of someone who has questioned a lot of the COVID lockdown stuff. So the idea that I was wearing a double mask outdoors is a little odd. And so I didn't come to this skeptical of the idea of COVID lockdowns and masking and all that. When I drove my mother across the country to get vaccinated, I was horrified in January of 2021 to go into rest stops in Red America and see all these people unmasked. I wrote about it. You can go see it. And yet over time, the more I looked at the data and the more I looked at the evidence, I came to believe that it wasn't clear that anything from a policy perspective other than vaccines mattered. I think masks work, and I think on an individual level, wearing masks often makes sense. If you're sick, if you have a particular vulnerability, if you just have something big upcoming and you don't want to get sick, masks work. Mask mandates don't work. And the way to think about this is, do you remember the mask mandates on the plane? You'd get on United Airlines and we'd all have our masks, and then we'd be allowed to take them off to eat our stroopwafels, right? As if somehow COVID didn't spread while we were eating our stroopwafels. Like, a mask mandate can only work if actually we're wearing masks as opposed to wearing them sometimes. And the more and more I looked at the data, the more I thought that the so-called experts were getting a lot of stuff wrong. And the experts overwhelmingly came from the political left. There were other experts who I thought were getting stuff right, who it often so happened just tended to be a lot less politically liberal. They were looking at the same data. And that experience, I am obviously someone from the left half of the political spectrum. That experience really caused me to try to be introspective about what are some of the other things in which I might not have been looking at the evidence with the open mind that I should have, and just thinking those ignorant people are wrong and all the people I hang out with are right.
Lab leak versus...
Lab leak, right. And I think that's also important because if you asked me to guess right now, I would guess the lab leak theory is wrong.
Oh, really?
But it's like 60-40. Right. It's not 99-1. It's not a conspiracy theory, right? And so it's not that one side is always right or wrong, or the elites are always wrong.
Oh, whether COVID came from natural origins, such as a bat, or
right.
whether it was in a lab and it leaked.
Right. And basically, Tom Cotton and Donald Trump said lab leak is right, and so the entire left half of the political spectrum said it must be wrong.
And that it was racist.
And that it was racist. And honestly, and then I'll give you the microphone back, school closures are another example. You go back and you look at what progressive public health experts were saying about school closures in the summer of 2020 when we had to decide whether to reopen schools in 2020. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that we made a mistake in hindsight. I think in the moment it was really, really hard to reopen schools without vaccines. But in hindsight, it's clear it was a bad decision. And expert opinion turned when Donald Trump tweeted, "Open the schools now."
I was thinking about modern politics and sort of where we are now in terms of what you call in the book and what many people would call neoliberalism. So neoliberalism, there's sort of a right-wing formation of it, which begins, earlier with Milton Friedman, but then with the Democrats, there's also a sort of form of neoliberalism that begins with Jimmy Carter. It takes full bloom with Bill Clinton. You write, kind of as an aside in the book, that Biden has represented the sharpest break with the neoliberal era, and I agree with that. I mean, we'll see if it's a sustained break, but I think that I would agree with that. So what worries me, as somebody who's very sympathetic to the arguments you're making, is the American people's views on the economy and Biden's handling of the economy are not great. And I, as somebody who is sort of a skeptic of a lot of, what we think of as neoliberalism, it gives me some pause as well, because I do think Biden has sort of is tacking back to an earlier era of more communal thinking and less, market-based thinking that I would have thought would have been more popular. So what do you make of that?
I actually think in some ways it's one of the hardest questions in American politics today. And so let me start by saying, I don't know, and then I'll talk a little bit about some things that I think we can know. I mean, it's really jarring that Joe Biden, who has invested much more in future R&D and future investments, really than any president in a long time, has opened these semiconductor factories in Ohio, and it appears to be doing nothing for him in Ohio. Electorally, yes. So there's an aspect of this that's a mystery. I don't think it's because at root the American people embrace neoliberal views. And I think there's much more evidence on the side that they don't than that they do. Now we're just talking about politics, not what works and what doesn't. But I mean, look at what happens when minimum wage increases, which are decidedly not neoliberal, go on the ballot in red and purple states. Look what happened when Medicare expansion goes on the ballot in red and purple states. Look what happened when Donald Trump ran for the Republican nomination and said trade is bad. Immigration, we don't think of that as a neoliberal policy, but it is. Immigration is bad, and I'm going to protect Medicare and Social Security. And he ran away with the Republican nomination. So it looks like even the Republican base of voters. So I tend to think that instead what has happened is that there are many ways actually in which our economy is still quite problematic. Some of them are the long-term ways I mentioned. But some of them are actually short-term. And I think when we ask people about the economy, they don't just think about dollars and cents. There are all kinds of ways in which our economy still hasn't recovered from COVID. Attendance at almost everything is down. I mean, we have a lot of college professors here. College professors I've talked to said they still don't get class attendance that they got pre-COVID. Churches is down. My wife is a leader in our community. Volunteerism in our community is down. I just stumbled on some old pictures of high school basketball games at my high school and was jarred by how many people were in the stands 5 years ago. So I spend a lot of time in both Washington and New York. You know what's way up? People jumping the turnstiles. I mean, every week, I see people jumping the turnstiles in a way that I just never did before COVID. So there are all kinds of ways in which disorder is up and communal stuff is down, on top of the inflation stuff. So to me, it's not so much a question of Biden's turn away from neoliberalism has made him unpopular. It's that it's been strikingly impotent at overcoming these other problems.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, which is, one of the things that drives me nuts about the commentary these days is how great America is doing, right? America's booming. Unemployment is at an all-time low. Inflation's falling. Europe is a catastrophe. I heard today that Britain has shrunk. The British economy has shrunk for the second quarter in a row, for instance. And America is the opposite of this. But, the bodies are piling up in the streets, right? So we're very grateful, I speak for Anne too, I think, for the prominence you gave to our work. But, why is this catastrophe, this mortality catastrophe that's going on, not more salient? And why? Maybe it's because politicians don't think they can do anything about it. They're not trying very hard, but maybe they think it's outside their control. It's like a plague or something. But you've got all this booming going on, and the bodies are piling up in the streets. And the numbers are enormous. I mean, you don't get these little declines in life expectancy without a lot of people dying who shouldn't be dying, right? And yet, A, we don't seem to care about it very much. And B, I wonder whether it's something to do with people not feeling very good about the world, that a lot of their elders, their seniors, who should have been still alive are still dead and are still dying.
Yeah. It really is true when you look, I mean, I ticked these off, but I mean, look at car accidents, and we've become an outlier in a way that we weren't 15 years ago. Obviously, opioid deaths, we've become an outlier in the way, we always drove more than other countries, but we've really, the gap has widened on car accidents. Obviously, the gap has widened on opiates. You could see in that chart, we were much worse at vaccinating people during COVID and saving their lives than other countries.
Eastern Europe used to look like.
And suicide, and you just kind of keep going down the list, and it's one thing after another. I don't fully know the answer to that question. It is certainly the case that there are headline measures that are not irrelevant and are not false by which the United States still outpaces Europe. I mean, we really do outpace Europe in GDP, right? And a lot of our national debate is driven by people who've really done quite well. And life really is better, not just for the very, very rich, but for the merely affluent, the people who are journalists and think tanks. I mean, life really is better in many ways, not in all ways. But I also agree with you that, like the fact that Biden has not gotten more credit for what he's done, there is something of a mystery for why there isn't more attention on just how many ways we are failing to keep ourselves alive. And I mean, part of me actually this is an incredibly narrow thing, but part of me was wondering, should I try to figure out a way where every month the New York Times is going to report on life expectancy statistics the way we report on the unemployment rate every month, just to try to get a little bit more attention?
Good luck with that. I mean, the CDC still has not published the raw data for 2022, right. And we're in 2024. And I mean, that's a real scandal. So trying to update this on a daily basis is extraordinarily hard. And that's a huge flaw in our statistical system. I mean, the other thing that's happened is if you talk to people who really care about mortality, it's all heavily infected by the sort of wokeness that drives the working classes completely insane. So, you know, you read the NIH stuff, you read the CDC stuff, it's all about disparities, you know, but it's not about this, not about saving lives.
One more? Okay, this is the last question. So you mentioned that there could be some allies on the political right for a different type of economic approach. Josh Hawley, I believe you mentioned by name, American Compass. Do you think that the Josh Hawleys or Ted Cruz or maybe Marco Rubio, who talk about sort of workers' rights against, you know, woke bosses, do you think that is that more just a play against the woke, you know, quote unquote woke bosses, or do you believe that there is a constituency among the current GOP, you know, to actually support unions, to repeal right to work laws, you know, things when the rubber hits the road, will they be there for a more worker-driven economy?
That was your very nice way of saying, are you totally naive and crazy? Look, I think unlikely coalitions need to include unlikely partners. And I think I don't see in the Senate any sort of emergence so far of meaningful Republican votes, say, for labor law reform. And I certainly don't see it on the Supreme Court, which is really important and shows no sign of that. However, I also see meaningful change. Yes, Donald Trump went and visited a non-union shop during the UAW strike, but he pretended he was visiting a union shop in a way that Ronald Reagan never would have done. And Marco Rubio signed a letter saying labor unions are an important part of an economy, but we just need to make them not a wholly owned subsidiary of the Democratic Party. And there really are policy people on the right, I don't mean people who have power, you just mentioned American Compass, who genuinely believe in some of these ideas of, you know, we were told that global trade was going to make America rich and China free. Not so much, right? And so I think it is a meaningful reflection of political change that people on the right now feel the need to reflect this. And I think one of the lessons of the labor movement of the early 20th century and the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century and the new right of the mid to late 20th century is that political change takes a really, really long time, and you have to shift the Overton window, and you have to attract unlikely allies. And so I agree with you. Josh Hawley is not about to start voting for minimum wage increases, but I think it would be a big mistake just to say it doesn't matter.
This should work in a minute.
Testing to, oh, there we go. So thank you so much for your talk today. It strikes me that your book can be conceived of as in dialogue with your New York Times colleague and former argument co-host Ross Dowdat's book on decadence, where you're both kind of advancing a thesis to explain stagnation in American society. And so I'm wondering if you see at all your book in dialogue with his, and if so, how so?
So first of all, go buy Ross's book on decadence, because it came out like the day society shut down for COVID. And it's a really good book. All authors can have complaints about when the timing of when their book came out with major news events, but Ross has a better claim on that than most. I do think there's a connection between the two. I do think there's a version of the story of stagnation I tell that is related to decadence. I mean, there's a way in which our shift to use the government to pay for healthcare programs that are phenomenally expensive and inefficient, rather than building the industries of tomorrow, is a form of decadence. And I also, just to Ross is a friend of mine, so I've betrayed my bias, but I think the kind of arguments Ross makes are really important, because Ross, and I disagree with Ross on a lot of things. If you listen to the argument, you know that. But Ross is the rare national high-profile journalist who has a serious claim on being in that quadrant. Was it the upper left quadrant of economically progressive, or at least progressive curious and socially conservative thinkers. And too often, that's not quite fair, too large of a share of the conservative writers and intellectuals who liberals engage with are lean more toward the other thing, rather than religious and like Ross.
Hi, I'm Ann Case. I just want to mention before I ask my question, Angus and I had a book that came out literally the day that the national emergency was declared for COVID. So
see,
my advice for authors is always try to avoid those plagues of biblical proportion. Yeah. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role that the financial crisis played and people trusting the system, that suddenly they realized it's not that we're all in this together. Their homes are being repossessed. No one goes to jail. And laws really don't change, or meaningfully. The teeth, come out of them soon after they've been implanted. And I think that's had a much more profound effect than attention is given to it. And I wondered what you thought about that.
One of the other things I've reflected on is I think that the left, broadly defined, not the far left, has not given enough thought to really political power and politics and how much they matter. And I think this is an example. I think on the merits, the combined very late Bush administration, but really the Obama administration and the Bernanke Fed, executed the most successful financial rescue, as far as I can tell, in recorded history. Alan Blinder will correct me if there's a more successful one than that. But on the merits, it's like hard to find a better one. But I also don't think they paid nearly enough attention to this issue, which is how would the financial crisis affect politics? How would people feel about it? And what would it do to the Obama administration's ability to then pass other things that they care deeply about and elect people in the future who looked more like what the Obama administration wanted to do than, say, the administration that actually followed it? And I think that was a real failure of the response to the financial crisis. And I say that as someone who, you will not find me writing they should have put bankers in jail and bailed out homeowners at the time. So I'm not claiming that I had great knowledge. But they really were not sufficiently attuned to how this would poison American politics and specifically damage the American left by not having a little bit more of what Tim Geithner called, for whom I have great respect, he called it somewhat dismissively Old Testament measures, punishing people. And I think it's part of a larger thing. Again, I am not arguing that that immigration chart exists mostly because there are huge wage effects of immigration. I agree with Angus. I think there are wage effects of immigration, and I think many advocates of it are wrong when they claim that it's a free lunch that doesn't have any wage effects. And by the way, if you doubt that, look at people who have positions of power in our society and how they treat immigration. Doctors do not treat immigration as if it has no effect on their wages. They make it really hard to come here as a doctor from another country and start practicing immediately because they understand that when the supply of doctors increases, the wage of any given doctor is probably going to go down. The same is true of construction workers and nurses and fields that have had many, many more immigrants come in. But I think the bigger effect with that is not the economic effect. It's that immigration politics almost universally, when you have huge surges of immigration, moves a country's politics to the right. And you can't reverse that by telling people, you're hateful if you do that. It just doesn't work. We see it in Europe, we see it in the United States, we don't see it in Japan and Korea, in part because they have incredibly restrictive immigration laws. So there's really no example of some country that's had a huge surge of immigration and not had a real increase in the right. And then the final example is the importance of labor unions. Obamacare, I was talking with some Princeton students about this earlier today. Obamacare really meaningfully improved the lives of millions of people. It really did almost nothing to kind of build future progressive movements. Do you know what does build future progressive movements? Labor unions. And yet labor law reform, which is super hard for all the reasons that you just mentioned, which is moneyed interests are aligned against it. Labor law reform is the thing, as I tell in the book, that one Democratic president after another says they're in favor of and doesn't quite do. You know, it's the only, LBJ was famous for getting Congress to do whatever he wants. Labor law reform is the only major part of the Great Society of his agenda that he didn't pass. Jimmy Carter had to choose between labor law reform and the Panama Canal Treaty to get it through Congress. He picked the Panama Canal Treaty. Barack Obama and Joe Biden, I think, were legitimately in favor of labor law reform. They didn't really run on it, though, and they didn't have the votes. And so I think that's an example.
I mean, I think Obama kind of betrayed the labor union on card check. He ran on it.
And didn't do it.
He didn't even try to do it.
Maybe I'm being too nice to Obama here.
Yeah, and I think that he's a kind of classic example of running on something, and really that was it disappeared when he won.
So, I mean, I think whether it's how you respond to the financial crisis, how you think about immigration, or how you think about the importance of labor law reform, all these things have economic effects, and they also have political effects. And I think the left has been too technocratic and not sufficiently strategic about what things will allow it to prosper. My colleague Jamel Bowie has a great line about this. He said, Democrats seem really confused about how important labor unions are to Democrats. Republicans seem crystal clear about how important labor unions are to Democrats.
But
I mean, that's something you haven't really talked about very much. You did talk about it in the talk, but a lot of these things, you know, it's not just labor unions got weaker. They got weaker because they were weakened.
Yes.
And because there's this enormous amount of corporate power pushing in the other direction. There was no one punished after the financial crisis because you would have had to challenge corporate power to get that. You can't pass minimum wage legislation because it would challenge the corporate power. So, I mean, there's an alternative, much more like a Marxist view of what's happening in America, which is that, you know, we're a bunch of piñatas that are being controlled and milked by the corporate sector.
I know we have another question. I would just say, I do think that organization can sometimes overcome that, right? We have lifted the minimum wage in a bunch of places. No. But if we lift all the state ones,
Fair, but
yeah.
I mean, it's been
Yeah.
stymied at the federal level since what, 09?
Yeah.
07?
Wait. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for speaking. This has been fabulous. And I also listened to your podcast with Katie Couric about this book as well. She seemed to chalk up George Romney's decision not to accept that raise as him just being a really fabulous person. But I totally agree with you that it's more symptomatic of that communitarian valued society that represented the US however many years ago. And I'm curious how you've done that research to track how legislation and community values are related and how you expect our ability to legislate and change community values and sort of like tip that scale to occur in the next few years, maybe even outside of like those grassroots organizations and labor movements.
Culture is such a hard topic because no one of us can really change the culture. But collectively, we could change the culture. It's just really hard to make that happen. And so I do think we can each do our part to think about it, right? There are certain careers, if you care about these issues, where you can meaningfully push in one direction, and then there are other careers where you're really not going to engage with them, or you're going to go along with the tide, right? And we've lived in an era where people on campuses like this tend to go to the latter set of those careers. I don't think they're bad people for doing so, but they're also not helping fix the problem. And so there are little ways that we can affect this. My wife, for example, wanted to go into nonprofit law before she changed her career, and everyone told her, well, you can't go into nonprofit law unless you first go to a law firm. And my wife's really stubborn, and she said, why can't I? And she, despite hearing 5 or 6 or 10 people tell her you need to first go to a law firm to go to nonprofit law, she only applied to nonprofit law, and she ultimately got one, right? And so there are little things that we can each do. I do think ultimately, though, the biggest effect on culture is political power. And that's a little bit what I meant about the Republicans, which is if we actually build stronger grassroots movements, if the Democratic Party becomes less disdainful of working class people, and working class people as a result have more power, the culture will shift with that. Part of the reason that the executives behaved the way they did was because they had real power on the other side against them, not, as you say, because they were just decent people. I like George Romney because I think Mitt Romney's a deeply decent human being, whatever disagreements you may have with him. Both he and his dad were. His dad returned a bonus. Mitt didn't.
So I think also you had asked, your question was, how do you do research into like values?
Sorry, I missed that.
No, but I actually wanted to little plug for the economics profession. There are a lot of tools that are coming online, through what's called natural language processing and AI and, big data that allow us for the first time, to at least better measure these, vibes. We can, take large corpuses of text, and these programs can, very easily do sentiment analysis. So it's actually it's kind of an exciting time to start thinking about how do we at least measure these norms? Because a lot of, when I was in grad school, there was a view that like norms mattered. That's not, a crazy idea that the idea, that somebody would turn down a bonus as a CEO did mean something, but it was just, anecdotes. And now I think it's an exciting time in social science to actually have access to something that's more than just anecdote and to be able to systematically trace these things across time and place. So just a little plug for some future research. I see a lot of, students in the audience. So I wanted to say
I would
that.
just say some norms have already changed. So as many worries I may have about the direction of our country, I defer to you two about this. But I think the norms in the economic profession have changed. I think for my generation, I'm not an economist, but people who are my age, who are in their 50s, and people older than me, the kind of market-driven ideas are absolutely dominant. And I actually remember the first time you and I ever chatted, and I chatted with Suresh Naidu, who's a co-author of yours. And I remember, something is changing. That a lot of what the beliefs you have about what the data show are not the sort of right of center beliefs that economists had always had.
I think that's right. I do think the economics profession is changing. As David alluded to, I think I was one of the very few economists I knew, Suresh was as well, who supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. And so that definitely, put me in a. I kind of feel like I know every single economist who supported Bernie in 2016 because there were so few. But I was recently at a conference at MIT organized by very established figures in the profession that were sort of saying a lot of the things in your book, for example. So now I had this weird, uncomfortable feeling of like people agreeing with me and thinking something's off here. But I do think the profession has changed.
Another book I would recommend is The Last Politician. Frank Foer is a writer for The Atlantic. He used to run The New Republic. I knew him a little bit before, and then we both wrote our books at the same coffee shop in Washington, D.C., Compass Coffee on Mass Ave, which I highly recommend. And so basically what we did over months was we would eye the other one to see, is he in a midst of a big productive spurt? And when we both seemed to be slowing down, we'd grab 20 minutes of coffee with each other. We basically wrote our books together. He has a chapter about Jake Sullivan, who's a few years younger than me, who's a national security advisor, who has these glittering establishment credentials, Rhodes Scholar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly the kind of resume where he would have had kind of these sort of very establishment, center-right economic views that sort of masquerade as center-left, right? A center-left person who you would have considered center-right. And what Frank tells in the book is the story basically of how Jake came to question his own views and how he became more skeptical of neoliberalism. And I said to Frank, I loved that chapter. I think Jake Sullivan's a really interesting thinker. It's important because Sullivan has driven a lot of Biden's thinking as well. And I said, and I couldn't help but notice that when you were describing the journey that Sullivan's been on, I think you were also describing the journey that you, Frank, have been on. And he said, you're right. And I said, you also described the journey that I have been on in terms of my own ideas about being more skeptical of market-driven solutions and thinking they don't work as well as I used to.
Before we get too self-congratulatory, the last chapter of my new book is called, Is the Crisis, Was It Produced by Economists, right? And I can tell you there's a lot of pushback. So there's plenty of pushback on that side. And, I'm too old to be part of the younger set that you guys are talking about. So it's not just the young people on this. But I do think there's a lot of pushback. And the real pushback in some sense is something we talked about a minute ago, which is corporate power. And it's not just in the US. I mean, it's sort of around the world. And there is this sense in which, we've made these corporations that we allowed them to get incredibly powerful, for their executives to be incredibly well paid. There's this populist upsurge, but for the time being, it's being financed by corporate interests because that's where the Republican Party gets its money. And it's not entirely clear how long that can possibly go on before it fractures, because many of these corporate executives would be very comfortable in this room. Yes. Right? I mean, as long as they get well enough paid, they'll talk about their very liberal views, and somehow that's going to break. I don't know how stable you think that is.
I don't know. And obviously the near-term threat is something quite dark, right? I mean, the near-term threat is that these populist feelings are going to produce an authoritarian president, and that's real. And part of the kind of urgency and anger that you hear from me about how disdainful the left can be of working class people is it really could contribute to a Donald Trump victory. And forget about all these long-term ideas we're talking about, and forget about all of Trump's policy views, many of which are reasonable. But he rejects democracy. He rejects the rule of law. He is whether he does it or not, he's saying, I will use the law to punish my enemies and reward my friends. We've never had a figure like this. And I think setting aside the long term of building a more prosperous, broadly prosperous America, in the short term, the urgency for the Democratic Party to stop turning off so many voters by treating them as ignorant and hateful is the clear and present threat that Donald Trump represents to
traditions of American democracy, as flawed as American democracy has been.
I don't think we can end on a sort of better and urgent note than that. So if you can just join me in thanking David.